Margaret Whitmore pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she watched the dust settle in the corral. Another cowboy was picking himself up from the dirt, brushing off his pants and muttering under his breath. His hat lay crumpled 15 feet away where Thunder had sent it flying. The big black stallion stood at the far end of the corral, his chest heaving, his dark eyes wild with anger and fear. "That's 30, Margaret whispered to herself, counting on her fingers. 30 cowboys had tried to tame her late husband's prize stallion. 30 men had walked away defeated, some limping, some holding their ribs, all of them embarrassed. The cowboy who had just been thrown was named Billy Carson. He was young, maybe 25, with more confidence than sense. He had ridden into her ranch 3 days ago, bragging to anyone who would listen about all the horses he had broken. He claimed he once tamed a Mustang in under an hour. Margaret had heard it all before. "Ma'am, I think your horse might be touched in the head," Billy said as he retrieved his hat. There was dirt in his hair and a small cut on his cheek. No normal horse acts like that. Margaret's jaw tightened. She had heard this comment many times over the past month. Every failed cowboy seemed to think there was something wrong with Thunder. They never considered that maybe there was something wrong with their approach. "Thunder is perfectly fine," she replied coolly. "Perhaps you're just not the right man for the job." Billy's face reddened. He wasn't used to being told he wasn't good enough, especially not by a woman. "Lady, I've been working with horses since I was 12 years old. If I can't tame that beast, nobody can." Margaret had heard those exact words from at least 10 other cowboys. They all thought they were special. They all believed their experience made them superior to every man who had tried before them. And they were all wrong. "The offer still stands," Margaret said firmly. $500 to whoever can tame Thunder. But the horse has to accept a saddle and rider willingly. "No ropes, no force, no breaking his spirit," Billy snorted. "You can't tame a horse without showing it who's boss. That's not how it works." Margaret watched as Billy gathered his gear and headed toward his horse. She had heard this argument countless times. Every cowboy who came to her ranch believed the same thing. They thought taming a horse meant breaking its will, making it submit, through force and fear. But Margaret's husband Thomas had taught her differently. Thomas Whitmore had been the gentlest man Margaret had ever known. He could calm a spooked horse with just his voice. He never used whips or spurs or harsh bits. Instead, he worked with horses as if they were partners, not slaves. Thunder had been his greatest success, a wild stallion he had found injured in the mountains and nursed back to health. For 3 years, Thunder and Thomas had been inseparable. The horse would come running when Thomas whistled. He would follow Thomas around the ranch like a giant black dog. Thomas could ride Thunder bareback across the open plains, the two of them moving together like they shared the same thoughts. But then Thomas got sick. It started as a simple cough that wouldn't go away. Within 6 months, he was gone, leaving Margaret alone with a ranch to run and a horse that no longer trusted humans. Thunder had watched Thomas waste away, had seen the man who saved him grow weak and disappear. The horse seemed to understand that humans were fragile, temporary things that could leave without warning. After Thomas died, Thunder became a different animal. He wouldn't let anyone near him. He kicked at the ranch hands who tried to feed him. He broke through 3 different fences trying to escape. Margaret had to keep him in the strongest corral on the ranch, the one Thomas had built for. Difficult horses died at first. Margaret thought Thunder just needed time to grieve. She gave him space, hoping he would eventually remember that not all humans were threats. But weeks turned into months, and Thunder only became more wild and dangerous. Margaret began to worry that she might have to sell him, or worse, have him put down. That's when she decided to offer the reward. $500 was a lot of money, enough to attract cowboys from 3 states away. Margaret hoped that somewhere out there was a man who understood horses the way Thomas had. Someone who could reach Thunder's heart instead of just trying to break his spirit. But so far, every man who had tried used the same brutal methods. They came with ropes and whips and iron determination. They believed that taming meant conquering, that a good horse was a defeated horse. They would corner Thunder in the corral, throw a rope around his neck, and try to force a saddle onto his. Thunder fought them all. He reared up on his hind legs, striking out with his front hooves. He spun and bucked and threw himself against the fence. He bit at the ropes and snapped at any hand that came too close. The angrier the Cowboys got, the more wild Thunder became, until the corral looked like a war zone. Margaret watched it all with a heavy heart. She could see the fear in Thunder's eyes, the same look he had when Thomas first found him injured and alone. Each failed attempt made Thunder trust humans a little less. Margaret began to wonder if she was making things worse by letting strangers try to tame him. The worst part was listening to the Cowboys make excuses. They called Thunder crazy, mean, impossible. They said he was too far gone, that some horses couldn't be saved. A few suggested that Margaret should just have him shot and be done with it. Those men were asked to leave immediately. Margaret knew Thunder wasn't crazy or mean. He was scared and lonely and angry. He missed Thomas just as much as she did. But, unlike Margaret, who could talk about her feelings and cry when she needed to, Thunder had no way to express his grief except through anger. Every time a stranger entered his corral with ropes and demands, Thunder saw another threat, another person who might hurt him or leave him. As the sun began to set, Margaret walked slowly toward the house. The ranch felt too quiet without Thomas's voice calling out instructions to the hands. Even the other horses seemed subdued, as if they could sense the sadness that hung over everything like a gray cloud. Margaret paused at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back at Thunder. The stallion stood motionless in his corral, silhouetted against the orange sky. He was still magnificent, still powerful, but there was something broken in the way he held himself. His head hung lower than it used to. His proud neck seemed curved with sorrow. "I don't know what else to do, Thomas," Margaret whispered to the evening air. "I've tried everything I can think of. Maybe Thunder is too damaged to trust again." As if he had heard her, Thunder lifted his head and looked directly at her. For just a moment, Margaret saw a flicker of the horse he used to be. The horse who would nicker softly when Thomas approached, who would rest his great head against Thomas's shoulder like a tired child seeking comfort. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. She quickly wiped them away and climbed the porch steps. Tomorrow would bring another cowboy, another failed attempt, another reminder that some things couldn't be fixed with money or determination, but she wasn't ready to give up yet. Somewhere out there had to be a man who understood that taming wasn't about winning a battle. It was about earning trust, one gentle moment at a time. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending dust devils dancing across the empty corral. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and went inside, already dreading whatever tomorrow might bring. Margaret was sipping her morning coffee on the porch when she saw him walking up the long dirt road to her ranch. Unlike the other cowboys who had come before, this man wasn't riding a fancy horse or driving a wagon loaded with gear. He was walking, leading an old gray mare that looked like she had seen better days. His clothes were clean but patched in several places, and his boots had been resoled more than once. The man walked with an easy pace, not rushing like he had something to prove. He stopped every now and then to let his mare rest, patting her neck gently and speaking to her in low tones that Margaret couldn't hear from the porch. There was something different about him, something that made Margaret set down her coffee cup and pay attention. When he reached the yard, the man removed his hat and nodded politely. "Morning, ma'am. I'm Jake Sullivan. I heard in town about your stallion and the challenge you've put out." Margaret studied his face. Jake looked to be in his early 30s, with weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His eyes were gray like storm clouds, but they held a kindness that immediately put her at ease. Unlike the other cowboys who had strutted onto her property full of swagger and big talk, Jake seemed almost humble. Another cowboy looking for easy money, Margaret thought to herself, but she kept her expression neutral. "The rules are the same as I've told everyone else, Mr. Sullivan. $500 to whoever can get Thunder to accept a saddle and rider willingly. No ropes, no force, no breaking his spirit." Jake nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, I understand. But if it's all right with you, I'd like to just watch him for a while first. Get to know him a bit before I try anything." Margaret blinked in surprise. In all the weeks since she had posted the challenge, not a single cowboy had asked to simply observe Thunder. They all wanted to jump right into the corral and start trying to dominate the horse. You want to watch him? Yes, ma'am. Every horse has his own personality, his own way of seeing the world. I find it helps to understand what makes them tick before you try to work with them. Margaret felt a flutter of hope in her chest, though. She tried to push it down. She had been disappointed too many times to get her hopes up again. You can put your mare in the small paddock by the barn. There's fresh water and hay. The bunkhouse has an empty bed if you need a place to stay. Thank you kindly, ma'am. I appreciate your hospitality. Jake led his mare to the paddock and spent a few minutes making sure she was comfortable. Margaret watched from the porch as he checked her hooves and brushed a few burrs from her mane. Even with his tired old horse, Jake moved with careful attention, making sure she had everything she needed before he worried about himself. After settling his mare, Jake walked over to Thunder's corral and found a spot about 10 feet back from the fence. He sat down on an old wooden crate that one of the ranch hands had left there, pulled a worn book from his saddlebags, and simply began to read. Dr. who had been pacing restlessly around the corral, stopped and stared at this strange new human. The stallion was used to men who shouted and waved ropes and tried to catch his attention. But Jake just sat quietly, turning the pages of his book and occasionally glancing up at the sky as if checking the weather. Margaret found herself watching Jake almost as much as she watched Thunder. This was not what she had expected. Every other cowboy had immediately started planning their attack, studying the layout of the corral, discussing their strategy with anyone who would listen. Jake seemed content to just exist in the same space. As the horse, without making any demands at all, after about an hour, Thunder's curiosity got the better of him. The stallion slowly moved closer to the side of the corral where Jake was sitting. He stretched his neck out, trying to get a better look at this quiet human who wasn't trying to catch him or control him. Jake looked up from his book, made brief eye contact with Thunder, then went back to reading as if nothing had happened. This went on for most of the morning. Thunder would approach the fence, study Jake for a few minutes, then wander away to graze or drink from his water trough. Jake never tried to reach toward the horse or call to him. He just read his book and let Thunder get used to his presence. Around noon, Margaret brought Jake a plate of food and a cup of coffee. She was curious about this unusual cowboy who seemed so different from all the others. "What are you reading?" she asked, settling down on a nearby hay bale. Jake held up the book so she could see the cover. "It's about different ways to train horses, written by a man who worked with wild mustangs out in Nevada. He believed that you can't really tame a horse by forcing it to submit. You have to earn its trust first." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. This was exactly what Thomas used to say. "Most cowboys don't seem to think that way." "No, ma'am, they don't. Most folks think that bigger and stronger means better. But horses are smart animals. They remember how they're treated. If you hurt them or scare them, they'll spend the rest of their lives expecting more pain and fear." Jake glanced over at Thunder, who was standing near the far corner of the corral, watching them. "That stallion of yours, he's not mean or crazy like some folks might say. He's protecting himself from being hurt again. Something happened that made him stop trusting people." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. This stranger understood Thunder better in one morning than 30 other cowboys had in weeks of trying. "He belonged to my husband," she said quietly. "Thomas died about a year ago." "Thunder hasn't been the same since." Jake nodded slowly. "Horses form strong bonds with the people they trust. When those people disappear, it can break something inside them. They start to think that caring about humans only leads to pain." "Do you think—" Margaret hesitated, afraid to voice the question that had been haunting her. "Do you think Thunder can learn to trust again?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the stallion with those calm gray eyes. "I think any creature can learn to trust again, ma'am. But it takes time and patience. And the right person has to be willing to prove that they're worth trusting." That afternoon, Jake continued his quiet vigil by the corral. He finished his book and started whittling a small piece of wood he had found near the barn. His hands moved slowly and steadily, creating what looked like a tiny horse. Thunder watched from various spots around the corral, sometimes coming quite close to the fence before retreating again. As the sun began to set, Jake pulled an apple from his pocket and set it on the fence post closest to where he was sitting. He didn't try to coax Thunder over or make any noise to get the horse's attention. He simply placed the apple there and went back to his whittling. Thunder noticed the apple immediately. He approached the fence cautiously, stretching his neck as far as he could to sniff the fruit. But Jake was sitting too close, and Thunder wasn't ready to come that near to a human. The stallion retreated to the other side of the corral, but he kept glancing back at the apple. Jake seemed to understand. Without making any sudden movements, he stood up, took the apple from the fence post, and moved his crate about 15 feet further back. Then he replaced the apple and settled down. To continue his whittling, this time Thunder felt safe enough to approach. He snatched the apple quickly and trotted away to eat it in the corner where he felt most secure. Jake smiled slightly but didn't try to capitalize on this small victory. He just kept working on his wooden horse as if nothing special had happened. Margaret watched all of this from the porch, her heart pounding with excitement. It was the first time in months that Thunder had accepted anything from a human being. It was a tiny step, but it felt like a miracle. As darkness fell, Jake gathered his things and headed toward the bunkhouse. "Good night, Thunder," he said softly. To the stallion, "See you tomorrow." Thunder stood at the fence, watching Jake walk away. For the first time since Thomas's death, the great black horse didn't look angry or afraid. He looked curious, as if he was wondering what tomorrow might bring. Margaret sat on her porch long after Jake had gone inside, thinking about the quiet cowboy who seemed to understand that some victories couldn't be won with force. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally found the right man for the job. Jake had been at the ranch for 5 days now, and Margaret found herself looking forward to their morning conversations more than she cared to admit. Every day started the same way. Jake would walk over to Thunder's corral with his coffee and whatever book he was reading, settle down on his wooden crate, and simply exist in the horse's world without making any demands. On this particular morning, Margaret decided to bring her own coffee and join him. She had been watching from the porch for days, but she was curious to see things from Jake's perspective. "Mind if I sit with you?" she asked, carrying over another crate. "Not at all, ma'am." Thunder might be curious about having 2 visitors instead of 1. Margaret settled down beside Jake, close enough to talk quietly but far enough away that Thunder wouldn't feel crowded. The stallion was already approaching the fence, drawn by the routine he had come to expect. Over the past few days, Thunder had grown bolder about taking the apples Jake left for him. Yesterday he had even eaten one while Jake was still sitting nearby. "Tell me about yourself, Jake," Margaret said, keeping her voice low so as not to startle Thunder. "What did you do before you started wandering from ranch to ranch?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his hands busy with another small wooden carving. This one looked like it might become a bird. "I had my own place up in Colorado. Nothing fancy, just a small spread where I trained horses for folks who needed help with difficult animals." "What happened to it?" "Drought," Jake said simply. 3 years without enough rain. Lost most of my stock, couldn't pay the bank, had to sell everything just to cover my debts. Margaret heard the pain in his voice, though he tried to hide it. She understood what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. "I'm sorry, that must have been terrible." "It was hard," Jake admitted, "but I learned something important. When you lose everything, you find out what really matters. Turns out it wasn't the land or the buildings or even the money. It was the connection I had with the horses. That's something nobody can take away from you." Thunder had moved closer while they talked, drawn by their calm voices. He stood at the fence now, just a few feet away, his ears pricked forward as if he was listening to their conversation. "He's getting braver," Margaret observed. "He's starting to trust?" Jake corrected gently. "There's a difference. Brave means you're not afraid. Trust means you're still afraid, but you believe someone won't hurt you anyway." As if to prove Jake's point, Thunder stretched his neck toward them, his nostrils flaring as he caught their scent. Margaret held her breath, afraid that any movement might spook him. But Thunder simply studied them for a moment, then turned and walked away to graze. "He's beautiful," Jake said, watching the stallion move across the corral. "Your husband must have been quite a horseman to earn that kind of loyalty." Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever someone mentioned Thomas. He was special. He could gentle the wildest horse with just his voice. Thunder was his greatest success story. "Tell me about it," Jake said, setting down his carving to give her his full attention. Margaret found herself telling Jake the whole story. How Thomas had found Thunder injured and half dead in the mountains. How he had spent months nursing the stallion back to health, never rushing, never demanding more than Thunder was ready to give. How the two of them had become inseparable, moving together like they shared the same soul. "Thomas used to say that you can't tame a wild thing," Margaret said, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the morning sun. "You can only invite it to be your partner. The horse has to choose to trust you." Jake nodded slowly. "Your husband sounds like a wise man. Not many people understand that. The Cowboys who've been coming here certainly don't. They all think they can force Thunder to submit, make him forget Thomas, and accept them as his new master." "That's not how grief works," Jake said quietly. "Thunder isn't going to forget your husband. The goal isn't to replace that bond. It's to show him that trusting one person doesn't mean he can't trust another." Margaret looked at Jake with surprise. In all the months since Thomas's death, no one had put it quite that way. Everyone seemed to think Thunder needed to get over losing Thomas, as if love was something you could just leave behind. "You understand," she said softly. "I've lost people too," Jake replied. "And I've learned that the love doesn't go away. You just have to make room for a new love alongside the old." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Thunder move around his corral. The stallion seemed more relaxed today, less agitated than he had been when other cowboys were trying to work with him. He even approached the fence twice more, each time coming a little closer before retreating. Around midday, Margaret brought Jake lunch and lingered to watch him work. Instead of trying to interact with Thunder directly, Jake had started a new routine. He would take small pieces of wood from his pocket and carve them into tiny animals, then leave them on the fence posts around Thunder's corral. "What are those for?" Margaret asked, watching Jake place a wooden rabbit on a post near the water trough. "Just giving him something to investigate," Jake said. "Horses are curious creatures. When they're not afraid, they like to explore new things. These little carvings give Thunder something to think about besides whether I'm going to try to catch him." Margaret watched as Thunder approached the new carving, sniffing it carefully before moving on. Over the past few days, Jake had left a small wooden zoo around the corral. There was a tiny horse, a bird, a rabbit, and what looked like a miniature cow. Thunder had examined each one, sometimes knocking them off the post with his nose, sometimes just observing them from a distance. "You're very patient," Margaret said. "Patience is all I have," Jake replied with a sad smile. "I don't have money or a fancy reputation or expensive equipment. Just time and the willingness to let Thunder set the pace. The other cowboys think you're wasting time. Billy Carson said you were too soft to get the job done," Jake chuckled. "Billy Carson is the type who thinks louder means stronger. He's probably broken a lot of horses in his time, but I bet he's never had one choose to be his partner." That afternoon, Margaret found herself helping Jake with his strange approach to horse training. She brought him sandpaper to smooth his wooden carvings and sat with him while he worked. They talked about horses and ranching and life in general. Margaret discovered that Jake had a dry sense of humor and a way of looking at problems that she found refreshing. "Why don't you stay?" she asked suddenly, then immediately felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I mean, even if you don't succeed with Thunder, I could use a good hand around here. Someone who understands horses the way you do." Jake looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes serious. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I learned a long time ago not to make plans too far ahead. Life has a way of changing on you when you least expect it. Margaret heard the caution in his voice and understood. Jake had been hurt before, had lost everything he cared about. He was protecting himself the same way Thunder was, keeping people at a distance so they couldn't disappoint him. As the sun began to set, Jake made his usual rounds, checking the wooden animals he had placed around the corral and replacing any that Thunder had knocked down. The stallion watched him from across the enclosure, no longer retreating when Jake approached the fence. "Good night, Thunder," Jake said softly, just as he had every night since arriving. "Sleep well." This time, Thunder didn't just watch Jake walk away. The stallion moved to the fence and stood there, following Jake's progress toward the bunkhouse with his eyes. It was a small thing, but Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. Thunder was starting to care about this quiet cowboy, who asked for nothing and offered only patience and respect. As Margaret headed toward the house, she found herself thinking about Jake's words, about making room for new love alongside the old. Maybe Thunder wasn't the only one who needed to learn that lesson. Maybe it was time for her to stop protecting her heart so fiercely and allow herself to trust again, too. The thought scared her almost as much as it excited her. But watching Jake work with Thunder had shown her something important. Sometimes the greatest courage wasn't in forcing your way through fear. Sometimes it was in staying open to the possibility that things could be different, better, if you were brave enough to try again. 3 weeks had passed since Jake arrived at the ranch, and Margaret could hardly believe the change in Thunder. The stallion, who had once charged at the fence whenever anyone approached, now waited calmly for Jake's morning visits. He had even started nickering softly when he saw Jake walking across the yard, a sound Margaret hadn't heard since Thomas was alive. This morning felt different somehow. Margaret sensed it the moment she stepped onto the porch with her coffee. Jake was already at his usual spot by the corral, but instead of sitting on his wooden crate, he was standing at the fence. Thunder stood just on the other side, his great black head stretched toward Jake. Their faces only inches apart, Margaret held her breath as she watched Jake slowly extend his hand toward Thunder's nose. The stallion could have pulled away, could have reared up and struck out as he had done with every other cowboy. Instead, Thunder leaned forward and gently touched Jake's palm with his soft muzzle. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. It was the first time Thunder had allowed any human to touch him since Thomas died. She wanted to shout with joy, but she forced herself to stay quiet and still. This moment belonged to Jake and Thunder. Jake didn't try to do more. He didn't reach for Thunder's halter or attempt to stroke his neck. He simply stood there, letting Thunder explore his hand with careful sniffs and gentle nudges. After a few minutes, Thunder stepped back, but he didn't retreat to the far corner as he usually did. He stayed near the fence, watching Jake with curious eyes. "Well done, boy," Jake said softly to the stallion. "That was brave of you." Margaret walked over slowly, not wanting to disturb the peaceful moment. "I can't believe what I just saw," she whispered. Jake turned to her with a quiet smile. "He's ready to take the next step, but it has to be his choice. I'm thinking about going into the corral with him today, if you're comfortable with that." Margaret's heart leaped with excitement and terror. "Are you sure it's safe? What if he panics?" "There's always risk," Jake admitted. "But I think Thunder trusts me enough now to at least give me a chance. If he gets upset, I'll leave immediately. No forcing, no pushing. Just seeing if he's willing to share his space with me." Margaret nodded, though her stomach was tied in knots. She had watched 30 cowboys get thrown, kicked, and bitten by Thunder. The thought of Jake getting hurt made her feel sick. But she also knew that this was what they had been working toward. All the patience, all the gentle approaches, all the tiny steps had led to this moment. Jake spent the morning preparing carefully. He removed everything from his pockets that might jingle or make noise. He made sure his movements were slow and deliberate. Most importantly, he spent extra time just talking to Thunder, letting the horse get used to his voice and presence. "I'm going to come in there with you now," Jake said to Thunder, his voice calm and steady. "If you don't want me there, just let me know, and I'll leave. No hard feelings." Margaret positioned herself where she could see everything but far enough away that she wouldn't make Thunder nervous. Her hands were shaking as Jake approached the gate to the corral. Thunder watched Jake's every movement. His ears were pricked forward, alert but not afraid. When Jake slowly opened the gate, Thunder didn't bolt or charge. He simply stood there, waiting to see what this strange human would do. Jake stepped into the corral and immediately stopped. He didn't try to approach Thunder or corner him. He just stood near the gate, giving the stallion plenty of space and multiple escape routes. Thunder studied him for a long moment, then walked to the far side of the corral, not in panic but simply to maintain a comfortable distance. For the next hour, Jake did nothing but exist in Thunder's space. He sat down on the ground, pulled out one of his wooden carvings, and began to work on it. Occasionally he would glance up at Thunder, but he never stared or tried to make direct eye contact for too long. Thunder spent the time watching Jake, walking around the corral and testing this new situation. Several times he approached to within 10 feet of Jake, close enough to study this human who had invaded his territory but wasn't making any demands. Margaret found herself holding her breath over and over again. Every time Thunder moved closer to Jake, her heart pounded. But Jake remained calm and steady, never showing any fear or excitement that might spook the horse. The breakthrough came just after lunch. Margaret had brought Jake a sandwich and a cup of water, passing them through the fence rails. As Jake ate, Thunder's curiosity finally got the better of him. The stallion walked slowly across the corral, his steps careful and deliberate, until he was standing just 5 feet away from Jake. Jake looked up from his sandwich and smiled. "Hello there, Thunder. Thanks for letting me visit your home." "Thunder?" snorted softly, a sound that wasn't fear or anger, but something closer to a greeting. He stretched his neck toward Jake, sniffing the air around him, trying to understand this patient human who smelled of leather and kindness. Very slowly, Jake extended his hand again. This time, Thunder didn't hesitate. He moved forward and pressed his nose into Jake's palm, breathing warm air across his fingers. Jake remained perfectly still, letting Thunder investigate him thoroughly. "You're a good boy," Jake whispered. "Your Thomas was right to love you so much." At the mention of Thomas's name, Thunder's ears flicked forward. Margaret gasped softly. She had been afraid that talking about Thomas would upset Thunder, but instead the stallion seemed to understand that Jake respected the bond he had shared with her husband. Gradually, Jake began to stroke Thunder's nose, then his forehead, then the sides of his neck. Thunder leaned into the touch, his eyes half closed with pleasure. It was like watching a miracle unfold. This wild, angry horse was becoming gentle again, remembering what it felt like to trust. A human's hands. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she was witnessing. But it wasn't just Thunder's transformation that moved her. It was watching Jake work, seeing his infinite patience and gentleness, understanding that this was a man who could heal broken things without trying to possess them. As the afternoon wore on, Jake and Thunder grew more comfortable with each other. Jake was eventually able to run his hands along Thunder's neck and shoulder, checking for any tender spots or old injuries. Thunder accepted the touch calmly, occasionally nudging Jake's shoulder with his nose as if asking for more attention. "He's in good shape," Jake called to Margaret. "Strong and healthy. Your husband took excellent care of him." "Thomas always said Thunder was the finest horse he'd ever worked with," Margaret replied, her voice thick with emotion. As the sun began to set, Jake knew it was time to leave the corral. He had accomplished more than he had dared to hope for, and he didn't want to push Thunder too hard on their first day sharing the same space. "I'm going to go now, Thunder," Jake said softly, giving the stallion one last gentle pat. "Thank you for trusting me. We'll do this again tomorrow if you're willing." Thunder followed Jake to the gate, not wanting their time together to end. As Jake stepped out of the corral, Thunder pressed his face against the fence rails, watching him with what looked like disappointment. "He doesn't want you to leave," Margaret observed, amazed by the change in the horse's behavior. "That's a good sign," Jake said, latching the gate carefully. "It means he's starting to enjoy human company again." That evening, Margaret and Jake sat on the porch, watching Thunder graze in the fading light. The stallion looked peaceful and content, no longer the angry, frightened animal he had been just weeks before. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said quietly. "I thought Thunder was lost forever. I thought he'd never trust anyone again." Jake was quiet for a moment, whittling another small animal from a piece of pine. "He was never lost, Margaret. He was just hurting. Sometimes all a broken heart needs is someone willing to be patient while it heals." Margaret looked at Jake's profile in the lamplight, seeing the gentle strength that had won Thunder's trust. She realized that her own heart was healing too, opening up to feelings she thought she'd never experience again. Jake had shown her that it was possible to honor the past while still embracing the future. "Will you try riding him soon?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "Not yet. Thunder's learning to trust me on the ground first. Once he's completely comfortable with me in his space, once he's choosing to be with me instead of just allowing it, then we'll think about a saddle. These things can't be rushed." Margaret nodded, understanding now why Jake's approach was so different from all the others. He wasn't trying to conquer Thunder or prove his own skill. He was building a relationship, one gentle moment at a time, based on mutual respect and trust. As they sat together in the peaceful evening, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in over a year. Hope. Hope that Thunder would be whole. Again, hope that the ranch would feel like home instead of just a place where she existed. And maybe, just maybe, hope that her own heart was ready to trust again too. 6 weeks had passed since Jake first walked up the dusty road to Margaret's ranch, and this morning felt like the culmination of everything they had worked toward. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake move around Thunder's corral, with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there. The stallion followed him like a giant black shadow, nudging his shoulder whenever Jake stopped moving over the past 2 weeks. Jake had been working with Thunder every day, gradually introducing new experiences. First, he had brought a soft rope into the corral, letting Thunder investigate it and become comfortable with its presence. Then he had gently draped it over the stallion's neck, removing it immediately if Thunder showed any signs of stress. Slowly, patiently, he had built up Thunder's tolerance until the horse accepted the rope as naturally as he accepted Jake's touch. Yesterday, Jake had brought a blanket into the corral. Thunder had sniffed it suspiciously at first, but Jake's calm presence had reassured him. By the end of the session, Thunder was allowing Jake to place the blanket on his back. Though Jake always removed it after just a few moments, today, Jake had decided it was time for the next step. Margaret's heart pounded as she watched him carry a saddle toward the corral. Not the heavy, elaborate saddles that the other cowboys had tried to force onto Thunder, but a simple, lightweight one that Jake had borrowed from the tack room. Thunder saw the saddle and tensed slightly, his memories of past struggles making him wary. But Jake didn't approach him immediately. Instead, he set the saddle down in the middle of the corral and stepped back, giving Thunder space to investigate it on his own terms. The stallion circled the saddle several times, snorting and pawing at the ground. Jake stood quietly nearby, his presence a calming influence. After several minutes, Thunder's curiosity overcame his caution. He stretched his neck toward the saddle, sniffing it carefully, exploring this new object that had appeared in his territory. "It's all right, boy," Jake said softly. "It's just another tool, like the rope and the blanket. Nothing to hurt you." Margaret held her breath as Jake slowly picked up the saddle and approached Thunder. The stallion's ears flicked back and forth, uncertain but not panicked. When Jake stopped a few feet away, Thunder took a step toward him, as if asking what this new game was about. Jake spent nearly an hour just letting Thunder become familiar with the saddle. He held it where the horse could see and smell it. He ran the stirrups along Thunder's neck and shoulder, getting him used to the feel of leather against his coat. Every movement was slow and deliberate, every touch gentle and non-threatening. Jake finally placed the saddle on Thunder's back. The stallion barely reacted. He stood calmly, his trust in Jake so complete that this new experience didn't frighten him. Jake secured the girth loosely, checking Thunder's reaction at every step. "Good boy," Jake murmured, stroking Thunder's neck. "You're doing so well." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched this miracle unfold. The horse that had thrown 30 cowboys now stood quietly wearing a saddle, his ears forward and his eyes calm. But she knew the real test was still to come. Jake led Thunder around the corral several times, letting him get used to the weight and feel of the saddle. The stallion moved with his usual grace, showing no signs of distress or resistance. When Jake stopped and began to adjust the stirrups, Thunder turned his head to watch, curious about what his human friend was doing. "Are you ready for this, Thunder?" Jake asked quietly. "We're going to try something new together." Margaret knew she should probably look away, should protect herself from the possibility of seeing Jake get hurt. But she couldn't take her eyes off the scene in the corral. This moment felt too important, too precious to miss. Jake placed his left foot in the stirrup, but he didn't mount immediately. Instead, he put some weight in the stirrup and bounced gently, letting Thunder feel the pressure and movement. The stallion stood rock-still, his trust in Jake absolute. Slowly, carefully, Jake swung his right leg over Thunder's back and settled into the saddle. For a moment, both horse and rider were perfectly still, as if they were both absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Then Thunder took a step forward, then another. Jake sat deep in the saddle, his hands gentle on the reins, his voice soft and encouraging. Together they moved around the corral in a slow, peaceful walk. There was no bucking, no rearing, no wild attempts to throw the rider. Thunder carried Jake as if he had been doing it all his life. Margaret sobbed openly now, overwhelmed by the beauty of what she was witnessing. This wasn't a man breaking a horse. This was two beings choosing to trust each other, to work together as partners. It was everything Thomas had believed in, everything he had tried to teach her about the relationship between humans and horses. After several circuits of the corral, Jake dismounted and immediately began praising Thunder, stroking his neck and feeding him pieces of apple from his pocket. The stallion nuzzled Jake's shoulder affectionately, as if he was proud of what they had accomplished together. Margaret rushed out of the house and ran toward the corral, her heart bursting with joy and relief. "Jake, oh my goodness, Jake, you did it, you actually did it." Jake smiled at her through the fence rails, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "We did it," he corrected gently. "Thunder chose to trust me. I just gave him the time and space to make that choice." Thunder came to the fence where Margaret stood, stretching his nose toward her. For the first time since Thomas died, the stallion allowed Margaret to touch him, accepting her gentle strokes along his forehead. It was as if Thunder understood that he was safe now, that these humans were his friends. "I can't believe it," Margaret whispered, running her fingers through Thunder's black mane. "I thought I'd lost him forever. I thought he'd never be the same." "He's not the same," Jake said quietly. He's different now, changed by what he's been through. But that doesn't mean he's broken. Sometimes the things that change us make us stronger, more careful about who we trust. Thunder knows now what real partnership feels like. That evening, Margaret and Jake sat on the porch, watching Thunder graze peacefully in the moonlight. The stallion looked content and relaxed, no longer the angry, frightened animal he had been when Jake first arrived. "So," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice casual, "I suppose you'll be moving on now. You've earned your $500. Jake was quiet for a long moment, whittling another small animal from a piece of wood. This one looked like it might be a dog. "Actually, I was hoping we could talk about that." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I was thinking maybe I don't want the money as payment for taming Thunder. Maybe I'd like to think of it as something else." "Like what?" Jake set down his carving and looked directly at Margaret. In the lamplight, his gray eyes were warm and serious. "Like a wedding gift, maybe, if you'd be willing to have me?" Margaret stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Sullivan?" "I'm asking if you'd consider it," Jake said softly. "I know it might seem sudden, but these past weeks have shown me something important. I found something here I didn't expect to find. Not just Thunder's trust, but yours. And maybe, if I'm reading things right, something more than trust." Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't look away. "You're reading things right?" she admitted quietly. Jake reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I don't have much to offer you, Margaret. No land, no money, no fancy possessions. Just my hands and my heart, and a promise that I'll never try to tame you or change you. I'll just love you for exactly who you are. Margaret squeezed his hand, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. That's everything I want, Jake. That's more than enough. They sat together in the peaceful night, making quiet plans for their future. They would run the ranch together, training horses the gentle way that honored both human and animal. They would build a life based on trust and patience and the understanding that the best relationships couldn't be forced, only chosen. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, Margaret and Jake were married on the front porch of the ranch house. Thunder stood in the nearby paddock, wearing flowers in his mane and watching the ceremony with calm, intelligent eyes. The Stallion had become the ranch's greatest success story, a living example of what was possible when humans chose partnership over domination. As Margaret and Jake exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, Thunder whinnied softly, as if he was giving his blessing to this union of the two humans who had shown him that trust was still possible. The ranch was alive again, filled with the sound of laughter and the gentle neighing of horses, who were treated with respect and kindness. Margaret had learned that some victories couldn't be won through force or money or determination. The greatest victories came from opening your heart, being patient, and trusting that love would find a way to heal even the deepest wounds. And Thunder, the magnificent stallion who had once seemed lost forever, grazed peacefully in the afternoon. Son, living proof that with enough patience and understanding, any broken spirit could learn to trust again.